There comes a moment in a man's life when the noise fades, the crowd disappears, and the hands he thought would hold him let go. Friends grow distant, opportunities close, strength feels drained, and answers refuse to come. In that moment, when a man has no one but God, something sacred begins. What looks like abandonment to the world is often alignment in the spirit. God does not step in as a last option. He reveals himself when every other support has failed. When a man has no one but God, he learns the truth about dependence. He stops leaning on applause, validation, and human approval. He discovers that human support is seasonal, but God is constant. People can promise loyalty and still leave. Systems can promise security and still collapse. But God remains the same in silence, in storms, and in waiting. This season strips a man of illusions and introduces him to faith that does not need proof. In isolation, prayer becomes honest. There is no performance, no religious mask, no need to impress anyone. It is just a man and his creator. Tears become words, silence becomes language, weakness becomes worship, and slowly, without announcement, God begins to rebuild the man from the inside out. Not louder, but stronger, not proud, but rooted. When a man has no one but God, he discovers inner authority. He stops begging the world for permission to exist. He learns that God's approval outweighs rejection, and divine timing outweighs human delay. What once broke him begins to shape him. What once scared him begins to train him. Loneliness becomes a classroom, and pain becomes instruction. There are moments in life when a man discovers that presence is not the same as loyalty. People can stand beside you in good seasons, celebrate you in visible victories, and still disappear when pressure arrives, when challenges grow heavy, when your name no longer opens doors, when you can no longer offer value. Many who once claimed commitment quietly step away. This is not always because they are evil. It is because human support often depends on convenience, strength, and benefit. This painful realization marks the beginning of understanding why human loyalty has limits. When everyone leaves, God remains, not because he is obligated, but because faithfulness is his nature. God does not retreat when your life becomes confusing or when your strength weakens. He does not distance himself when your prayers sound broken, when your progress seems slow. Even in moments when you cannot feel him, his presence does not withdraw. Unlike people, God is not overwhelmed by your struggle or disappointed by your process. He stays when explanations run out and hope feels thin. This season exposes false security. A man begins to recognize how much he depended on people for stability, identity, and reassurance. When those supports vanish, it feels like free fall. But it is in that fall that God reveals himself as the only foundation that does not collapse. What once felt like abandonment becomes clarity. You learn who was assigned to seasons and who was never meant to be permanent. God's presence in isolation is quiet but powerful. He does not always rescue immediately. Sometimes he strengthens you to stand. He does not always remove the burden. Sometimes he teaches you how to carry it without breaking. This is where faith shifts from theory to survival. God stops being an idea you talk about and becomes the lifeline you hold on to. When everyone leaves, God remains to reshape trust. A man learns that being alone does not mean being forsaken. God's companionship does not depend on crowds or confirmation. He speaks in stillness, guides in uncertainty, and covers in vulnerability. In this place, confidence is rebuilt, not in people, not in circumstances, but in the unchanging nature of God. Isolation often feels like rejection at first. When a man finds himself separated from familiar voices, routines, and relationships, the immediate assumption is that something has gone wrong. He begins to question his worth, his choices, even his faith. But isolation in God's plan is rarely about loss. It is about what looks like being set aside is often being set apart. God uses isolation not to weaken a man, but to prepare him for what he could not survive without inner strength. In isolation, distractions are removed. The noise of opinions, comparisons, and expectations fades, and a man is forced to confront himself honestly. There is no crowd to hide in, no applause to chase, no external identity to lean on. This is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Before God can build something strong through a man, he must first build something solid within him. Isolation becomes the environment where foundations are laid, not where lives are destroyed. This season also reveals dependency. A man learns how much of his confidence was borrowed from people, how much of his motivation came from recognition, and how much of his peace depended on constant reassurance. When those things are gone, God steps in as the primary source. Faith matures because it is no longer supported by convenience. Trust deepens because it is no longer optional. God becomes real not through abundance, but through necessity. Isolation prepares character before exposure. God often hides a man before he introduces him. Skills can be developed in public, but character is shaped in private. In isolation, integrity is tested when no one is watching. Discipline is formed without reward. Obedience is practiced without applause. These quiet victories shape a man who will not collapse when attention returns. Isolation also sharpens spiritual hearing. Without constant noise, a man begins to recognize God's direction more clearly. Conviction becomes sharper, wisdom becomes deeper, and discernment becomes stronger. What once felt confusing starts to make sense, not because circumstances change, but because clarity grows. Isolation is not God pushing a man away. It is God drawing him close and preparing him for a future that requires strength, humility, and endurance. When a man is surrounded by people, prayer can easily become shaped by language, habit, and expectation. Words are chosen carefully. Faith is expressed politely, and emotions are often restrained. There is a subtle awareness of being heard by others, and without realizing it, prayer can turn into performance. But when a man has no one but God, that layer disappears. There is no image to protect and no role to play. Prayer is no longer about sounding faithful. It is about surviving. In isolation, prayer becomes raw and honest. There are moments when words fail completely, and all that remains are sighs, tears, and silence. A man stops pretending to be strong and starts admitting fear, confusion, and exhaustion. He asks questions he was once afraid to speak out loud. He confesses weakness without shame. This kind of prayer is not polished, but it is powerful because it is real. God is not moved by eloquence. He responds to truth. Without an audience, prayer deepens intimacy. A man begins to recognize God not as a distant figure, but as a present companion. Conversations become ongoing rather than scheduled. Prayer is no longer confined to specific times or places. It happens in the quiet moments, in the middle of stress, in the depths of loneliness. God becomes the first voice he turns to, not the last option after everything else fails. This season also teaches a man to listen, not just speak. When prayer is no longer rushed or routine, silence becomes meaningful. In stillness, clarity forms, conviction sharpens. Direction becomes clear. A man learns that prayer is not only about asking God to change circumstances, but about allowing God to change him. The absence of an audience removes distraction and creates space for transformation. When prayer becomes real, faith becomes personal. A man no longer believes because he was taught to. He believes because he has encountered God for himself. Prayer stops being something he does and becomes something he lives. And in that private connection, strength is renewed, purpose is clarified, and trust is quietly rebuilt. There is a hidden danger in leaning too heavily on people. It slowly transfers trust from God to human strength. A man may not notice it at first because support feels comforting and familiar. Advice, encouragement, connections, and approval can create a sense of security. But people are limited by emotion, capacity, and circumstance. When life shifts and those people can no longer show up, the collapse feels sudden, even though the foundation was never designed to hold that weight. When a man has no one but God, dependence is reset. He begins to understand that people are meant to assist, not sustain. God never intended human relationships to replace divine reliance. This realization is often painful because it comes through disappointment. Promises are broken, support fades, and expectations fail. Yet through this loss, God gently redirects trust back to where it belongs. What feels like removal is actually correction. Depending on God changes the way a man makes decisions. Instead of seeking constant approval, he seeks alignment. Instead of chasing reassurance, he listens for direction. Prayer becomes the first response and not the last resort. A man learns to move even when encouragement is absent because confidence now comes from conviction, not consensus. This kind of dependence builds courage that does not fluctuate with opinions. This shift also produces stability. People can be inconsistent, but God is not. Emotions rise and fall, but God's word remains steady. When a man depends on God, his peace is no longer tied to who stays or who leaves. He becomes anchored. Storms still come, but they do not control him. Loss still hurts, but it does not define him. Strength becomes internal rather than borrowed. Depending on God also purifies relationships. When people are no longer treated as sources, they can be appreciated as companions. A man stops demanding what only God can provide. He loves without desperation, listens without fear, and stands without needing validation. This dependence does not isolate him from people. It frees him from bondage to them and positions his life on a foundation that cannot be shaken. Silence is one of the misunderstood tools God uses. When a man prays and hears nothing, when doors remain closed without explanation, and when answers seem delayed, it is easy to assume abandonment or disapproval. But God's silence is rarely absence. More often, it is intention. A silence creates space where faith can grow beyond emotion and dependence can deepen beyond convenience. In silence, a man is forced to walk without constant confirmation. There are no clear signs, no immediate reassurance, no emotional highs to lean on. This is where immature faith struggles because it has been trained to expect instant feedback. But mature faith learns to trust even when God does not speak loudly. A man begins to move forward based on what God has already revealed, not on what he hopes to hear next. God uses silence to strengthen endurance. When instructions are not repeated and comfort is not quickly given, a man must choose obedience without reward. He learns to remain faithful without visible results. This kind of waiting stretches patience and develops spiritual resilience. It trains the heart to remain steady rather than reactive, grounded rather than desperate. Silence also exposes motive. When God is quiet, a man discovers why he truly follows him. Is it for blessings, answers, and relief? Or for trust, relationship, and obedience? Without constant response, shallow faith fades and genuine faith remains. What survives silence is real. What collapses under was never rooted. Through silence, God matures a man's perception. He learns that divine guidance is not always loud and dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle, formed through reflection, conviction, and discernment. A man becomes more attentive, more patient, and more spiritually aware. God's silence is not meant to confuse him, but to deepen him and prepare him for responsibilities that require wisdom, stability, and unwavering trust. Loneliness has a way of stripping life down to its essentials. When distractions are gone and companionship fades, a man is left alone with his thoughts, fears, and beliefs. In that quiet space, the question becomes unavoidable: what is really holding you together? Comforts that once felt strong, routine, success, relationships, noise begin to lose their power. Loneliness does not create weakness. It reveals where strength has truly been coming from. In lonely seasons, a man discovers how much of his stability was external. When conversations stop and affirmation is absent, the inner life is tested. Peace depended on constant interaction. It now feels fragile. If identity depended on being needed, it now feels threatened. This exposure can be painful, but it is necessary. God uses loneliness to redirect a man from surface level support to a deeper, more reliable source. Loneliness pushes a man inward before it lifts him upward. He becomes aware of patterns he once ignored, wounds he once avoided, and truths he once suppressed. There is no one else to distract him from these realities. This is not cruelty. It is refinement. God allows loneliness to bring unresolved issues to the surface so they can be healed rather than hidden. In this season, faith moves from background belief to active dependence. A man begins to rely on God not just for guidance, but for emotional survival. Scripture becomes companionship. Prayer becomes conversation. God fills the spaces that people once occupied, not as a replacement, but as a foundation. Loneliness teaches a man that God is not only a provider of answers, but a source of presence. Through loneliness, a man learns self-sufficiency anchored in God, not isolation rooted in fear. He becomes comfortable standing alone without feeling empty. Strength forms quietly, confidence grows internally, and peace becomes less reactive. What once felt unbearable becomes transformative because loneliness has revealed what truly sustains him when everything else is gone. Some of the hardest battles a man will ever fight happen where no one is watching. There are no witnesses to the nights of overthinking, the quiet resistance against temptation, the discipline to keep going when motivation is gone, or the decision to stay faithful when quitting would be easier. These unseen battles rarely earn recognition, but they shape the core of who a man becomes. What is built in private determines what can be sustained in public. When a man has no one but God, these hidden struggles become daily training. He learns to confront fear without encouragement, to choose integrity without accountability, and to keep his word when no one would know if he broke it. These moments not feel heroic, yet they are foundational. God often develops strength silently because true strength does not need applause to exist. Unseen battles teach endurance. A man discovers that he can survive more than he thought, not because circumstances change, but because resilience grows. He learns to carry pressure without collapsing and to remain steady without support. This endurance is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, consistent, and deeply rooted. It prepares him for responsibilities that cannot be abandoned when things become difficult. These battles also refine discipline. Without external pressure, a man must govern himself. He learns to control his thoughts, his reactions, and his habits. This self-mastery becomes a form of strength that no one can take away. God values this internal order because it sustains a man long after external structure disappears. In unseen battles, a man's relationship with God becomes practical rather than theoretical. Faith is exercised, not discussed. Trust is practiced, not assumed. A victory is measured not by what is gained, but by what is resisted. These private wins quietly shape a man who will not break when visible pressure arrives because he has already learned how to stand when no one was watching. There are seasons when a man feels like life is taking things away rather than adding anything new. Relationships fall apart, positions are lost, confidence weakens, and plans no longer work. It feels like regression, like everything he works to build is being dismantled piece by piece. But often, this stripping is not destruction, it is correction. God removes what a man has leaned on so he can rebuild him on what will actually sustain him. Stripping reveals false foundations. A man may not realize how much of his identity was tied to success, status, or acceptance until those things are taken away. When they disappear, he feels exposed and uncertain. Yet this exposure is necessary. God cannot build lasting strength on unstable ground. Or what is stripped was either out of season, out of alignment, or never meant to carry the weight of a man's purpose. This process is uncomfortable because it feels like loss without replacement. God does not always explain what he is removing or when restoration will come. The silence during stripping can feel heavy, but it is intentional. God is clearing space, not abandoning the structure. He is ensuring that what comes next is built with clarity, humility, and obedience rather than pride or dependence on appearance. As God strips a man, he also reshapes his perspective. Value shifts from what he has to who he is becoming. Confidence moves from external achievements to internal conviction. A man begins to recognize that being reduced does not mean being diminished. It means being refined. The unnecessary is removed so the essential can remain. Rebuilding after stripping is more precise. God does not rebuild randomly, He rebuilds intentionally. The man who emerges is not louder, but deeper. Not rushed, but stable. Not driven by fear of loss, but guided by purpose. The stripping process prepares him to carry future weight without breaking, because what God rebuilds correctly will not collapse under pressure. Approval has a powerful influence over a man's life. When it is present, confidence feels strong. When it is withdrawn, doubt quickly follows. Many men do not realize how deeply their sense of worth is tied to acceptance, being praised, needed, affirmed, or recognized. But approval is unstable. It changes with performance, popularity, and perception. When a man has no one but God, approval loses its grip and a deeper identity begins to form. Without constant validation, a man is forced to confront who he is when no one is affirming him. Titles lose meaning. Reputation fades. Comparisons no longer apply. This can feel unsettling at first because approval often provides direction and reassurance. But in its absence, God begins to redefine the man from the inside. Identity shifts from what people say about him to what God has spoken over him. Finding identity in God creates inner stability. A man no longer rises and falls with opinions. Praise does not inflate him, and criticism does not destroy him. He becomes anchored in truth rather than perception. This kind of identity brings freedom, the freedom to obey without applause, to stand firm without agreement, and to move forward without explanation. God-centered identity also produces courage. When approval is no longer the goal, obedience becomes easier. A man is willing to make difficult choices, endure misunderstanding, and walk alone if necessary. Fear of rejection loses power because belonging is no longer dependent on people. God becomes the source of affirmation, and His voice becomes the primary influence. As a man finds his identity in God, confidence becomes quiet but unshakable. It is not built on comparison or competition, but on clarity and purpose. He no longer needs to prove his worth or earn his place. He knows who he is, and not because others agree, but because God has established it within him. Faith is often tested most in seasons where a man feels cornered, where doors have closed, and where options seem limited. In comfort and abundance, it is easy to rely on what is visible, tangible, or familiar. When alternatives are plenty, a man can lean on convenience rather than conviction, on strategy rather than surrender. But when options are stripped away and life presents no easy way forward, faith becomes the only path, and it begins to grow at a speed that comfort cannot produce. When there is no one to lean on, no backup plan to rely on, and no crowd to validate decisions, a man learns to trust in God alone. Every step requires dependence, every choice is weighted with prayer, and every decision is an exercise in obedience. In these moments, faith is not theoretical, it is essential. The scarcity of options forces the heart to rely on what cannot fail, the promises of God. Limited options also refine discernment. When a man can no longer afford distraction or convenience, he must see clearly, choose carefully, and act decisively. Decisions are no longer influenced by peer pressure, convenience, or fear of judgment. They are guided by conviction and trust in God's timing and wisdom. The fewer the options, the sharper the focus, and the stronger the faith that carries him through uncertainty. Faith also grows through necessity. And when the world offers no solutions, the man is pushed to pray harder, wait longer, and believe deeper. Obstacles that would have been avoided in abundance now become the very circumstances that stretch endurance and strengthen reliance on God. These trials train faith in ways that ease and comfort never could. In scarcity, faith also produces resilience. A man discovers that God is enough even when human help is gone, financial relief is delayed, or social support disappears. He begins to see that survival, growth, and purpose do not depend on abundance. They depend on trust. In these seasons, faith becomes self-sustaining, practical, and unshakable because it has been exercised when there was nothing else to lean on. Elevation often feels like the goal, the moment when recognition, success, or influence appears. Many men dream of being promoted, celebrated, or positioned for impact. Yet God rarely elevates before obedience is established. Obedience is the foundation upon which lasting success, authority, and influence are built. When a man has no one but God, he begins to learn that following God's instructions, even when inconvenient, confusing, or challenging, is more valuable than immediate reward or recognition. Obedience is tested in hidden ways. A man may be instructed to wait, to speak less, to act humbly, or to maintain integrity when shortcuts seem easier. These instructions may not bring immediate results or applause, but God uses them to shape character, ensuring that elevation will not become a test of pride or impulsiveness. Obedience strengthens the inner life, aligning heart, mind, and action with God's will rather than the expectations of the world. When elevation comes before obedience, it often leads to failure. Many who receive position well or influence too early collapse under pressure because the internal discipline required to sustain it has not been developed. God teaches that the unseen seasons of obedience, the quiet acts of faith, the consistent choices to honor Him, the unseen victories over temptation, are the preparation that ensures elevation will not destroy the man who receives it. Obedience also cultivates trust. A man learns to follow God's instructions even when he does not fully understand the outcome. This faithfulness produces a reliance on God's wisdom rather than human reasoning. Decisions become rooted in divine direction rather than impulsive ambition. Obedience becomes a daily practice, a rhythm that aligns the man's life with God's timing. Through obedience, character is forged before opportunity is offered. A man discovers that influence is not given to the strongest, the loudest, or the most to the faithful. God uses the quiet seasons, the unseen struggles, and the unacknowledged sacrifices to test loyalty and commitment. By the time elevation arrives, a man is not only ready to receive it, he is prepared to sustain, honor it, and use it for God's purposes rather than his own desires. Waiting is one of the most difficult experiences a man can endure. When a man has no one but God, he often faces delays, postponements, and seasons where nothing seems to change. Every day can feel heavy, every hour slow, and every opportunity just out of reach. Yet it is in these waiting seasons that God works most profoundly. Waiting is not wasted time. It is a classroom where endurance is cultivated and wisdom is refined. Endurance grows when a man learns to persist despite uncertainty. Waiting tests patience, determination, and resilience. It challenges him to maintain faith when results are unseen and to act faithfully without immediate reward. A man discovers that strength is not measured by speed or outcomes, but by the ability to remain steadfast through prolonged difficulty. Each day of waiting becomes a building block for character, teaching the value of persistence in the face of discomfort. Wisdom also emerges from waiting. When a man is forced to pause, he has the opportunity to reflect, evaluate, and discern. Impulsive decisions, rash actions, and shortcuts are exposed as dangerous, while thoughtful planning and reliance on God's timing are reinforced. Waiting cultivates perspective. A man begins to understand that what arrives late often arrives better, and that divine timing surpasses human urgency. Waiting also teaches humility. In a world driven by instant results, a man learns that control is an illusion. Patience develops as he recognizes that God's plan cannot be rushed, and that alignment with purpose is more important than immediate gratification. Through this, endurance becomes not just physical or emotional, but spiritual, a steadfast trust in God's process rather than the world's timetable. Furthermore, waiting produces preparation. While the world judges stagnation, God uses these moments to equip a man for what is ahead. Skills are sharpened, character is tested, and insight is gained during these silent periods. By the time opportunity comes, the man has been molded into someone who can handle responsibility, make wise decisions, and act with confidence. Waiting, while uncomfortable, becomes the forge that strengthens resolve, deepens understanding, and ensures that when the time is right, a man is ready to step into the fullness of God's plan. Pain is one of life's most powerful teachers, but its lessons are often misunderstood. When a man experiences hurt, loss, betrayal, or disappointment, the natural reaction is to resist, blame, or numb the experience. Yet when a man has no one but God, pain begins to take on a different role. It becomes instruction rather than punishment. God allows pain not to destroy, but to educate, to redirect, and to reveal truths that comfort alone cannot teach. Pain exposes weaknesses, both seen and unseen. It shows where a man has depended on things that cannot sustain him, relationships that plans that were fragile, or pride that was misplaced. Through these moments, he is forced to confront reality and acknowledge areas that require growth. What seems like suffering is often a form of divine honesty, revealing what must change for the man to move forward in alignment with God's plan. Under God's guidance, pain teaches endurance. A man learns that difficulty is not a signal to quit, but an opportunity to persevere. Each challenge becomes a training ground for resilience. Pain sharpens character, builds patience, and strengthens determination. A man who learns to walk through pain with faith discovers that he is capable of more than he ever imagined. Pain also teaches discernment. In moments of struggle, a man begins to distinguish between what is temporary and what is essential, between what is harmful and what is beneficial. He learns to recognize divine instruction within adversity. Every setback, heartbreak, or disappointment carries a hidden message, a lesson in humility, trust, and reliance on God. Furthermore, pain cultivates empathy. A man who has walked through suffering develops a deeper understanding of others' struggles. Compassion grows naturally, and his responses to pain become more measured, patient, and intentional. What once would have produced bitterness now becomes wisdom, shaping him into someone who can guide, uplift, and inspire others. In essence, pain is a teacher that cannot be ignored. When guided by God, it becomes a masterclass in strength, character, and faith. A man begins to see that every trial, while difficult, carries the potential to shape him into the person God intended him to be, providing insight and preparation for the victories that lie ahead.